What was the worst rule your school ever enforced?
Picture this. You're in high school, just starting out, and things are already off to a bad start. The bathrooms are a disaster. Broken, vandalized, and almost never usable. So what does the school decide to do? They came up with a brilliant idea. Ready for this? They decided to shut down the bathrooms. Yep, you heard that right. No bathroom breaks for you, unless the whole school behaved perfectly. Stick around, because that's just the start of the madness. This was back in my freshman year, and honestly, I've never forgotten it.
Our school, struggling with constant vandalism in the bathrooms,
Decided that the best solution was to punish everyone. They came up with this rule: if any bathroom was vandalized, it would be closed for the rest of the week. That's right, a whole week. And if it happened again, a full quarter without that bathroom. But wait, here's where it gets even crazier. On the third offense, they just shut it down permanently. They thought this would help, but within a day they had to reverse it after every bathroom in the school was closed. People were scrambling, and it became impossible to even get through a day without someone holding it in during class. They didn't think this one through, did they? Story 1. The bathroom lockdown. So, imagine this. You're in class, you're learning, and your stomach starts growling. Maybe you're trying to stay focused. But now all you can think about is how badly you need to use the bathroom. But here's the problem. The bathrooms are closed. All of them. All week long. There's not a single bathroom open in the entire school. How is that supposed to work? This rule was ridiculous. But it didn't stop there. If a bathroom got vandalized, not only did the kids responsible get in trouble, but every single student had to suffer. Want to take a bathroom break? Too bad, you're stuck in class until the bell rings. If it rings on time, it felt like a prison sentence. But guess what? Everyone rebelled. By the end of the first day, the entire school was up in arms, and they had to backpedal. They reopened all the bathrooms, but here's the twist. The rule was still technically there for a while, just waiting to pop up again later. I don't think the school realized how bad this was going to be, but it was the beginning of some of the most bizarre rules I'd see throughout my school years. Story 2. The 5-minute lunch rule. Now let's talk about lunch, because honestly, some of these rules were even more absurd. Ever heard of a lunch break that gets shorter each year? Yeah, that was a thing at my school. Every year they decided that the last 5 minutes of lunch were just too dangerous. Why? Apparently, bad things happened in the last 5 minutes of lunch. What kind of bad things, you ask? Well, nothing except kids talking and hanging out like they normally would. But no, they decided to shorten lunch by 5 minutes every single year to prevent chaos. And here's the kicker. If you had a group of more than 5 people, you were basically deemed to be up to no good. You could get in trouble for standing in a group larger than 5. I'm talking about a tiny Catholic school, by the way. Not some big public institution with a history of trouble. This wasn't a school filled with at-risk kids or anything like that. The worst thing any kid did while I was there, maybe walk across the street to grab a soda from the local store. Seriously, this rule was just that unnecessary. But here's the real question. Did it actually stop any problems? Of course not. All it did was make lunch feel even more rushed, stressful, and honestly ridiculous. We were all just waiting for the next year, when they'd cut another 5 minutes. It felt like they were trying to turn lunch into a military drill rather than letting us be kids. Story 3. The zero tolerance fight rule. Okay, so let's move on to the zero tolerance policy. You know the kind, the ones where no context matters, and urban gets punished equally. Well, that was the case at my school, when it came to fights. Sounds fair, right? If you're involved in a fight, you get suspended. But wait, here's where things get complicated. I got suspended once, and let me tell you, I wasn't even involved in the fight. I wasn't throwing punches, kicks, or doing anything remotely aggressive. But here's what happened. Someone knocked the books out of my hands, and when I bent down to pick them up, they punched me in the face. That's right, out of nowhere, just a random punch in the face. So what did the school do? They suspended me. Why? Because I was involved. Never mind that I didn't throw a punch, didn't start anything, was just trying to mind my own business. But no, the zero tolerance rule didn't care about context. That's how I ended up getting punished for being the victim. This is the exact reason why no tolerance policies rarely work. Context always matters. But of course, no one was listening. Story 4. The hypocrisy of the school mascot. And while we're on the topic of bizarre school policies, let's talk about my high school mascot. You know, the one that's supposed to represent school spirit. Ours was Daniel Boone. Yep, the legendary frontiersman, holding a musket. I'm not kidding. But then, one day, a kid wore a Guns N' Roses shirt to school. Now I get it. Guns aren't exactly something you want to encourage at school. But here's where it gets hypocritical. The kid was told to change because of the pistols on the shirt, even though our school mascot was literally holding a musket. You can't make this stuff up. The kid pointed out the glaring hypocrisy, and as a result, the school did the only thing they could. They changed everything. Suddenly, Daniel Boone was holding a flagpole instead of a musket, and all the signs around the school gone. They replaced every single instance of that mascot, including the massive one in the middle of our basketball stadium. Talk about a dramatic change. Honestly, it's a bit hilarious. I mean, I get that they wanted to avoid any sort of conflict over gun imagery, but completely changing the mascot seemed like overkill. The whole thing became a symbol of the school's inability to think things through, and well, how ridiculous the rules could get. Story 5. The hat ban. Because of gang colors. Now let's dive into something equally ridiculous. The Great Hat Ban. You'd think this is a rule that was put in place for safety, but no, it was about preventing gang affiliations. The reasoning: hats could signify gang color. But here's the problem. The only gang in the area was the Hells Angels, and I can promise you, they weren't sending their kids to school to show off gang colors through hats. But it didn't stop there. A few years after I graduated, I came back to volunteer as a chaperone for a school trip. And what do I get? The principal literally sprinting across the school to chase me down. Why? Because I was wearing a beanie. He demanded that I take it off, but when I told him I wasn't a student anymore and didn't have to follow the dress code, he got way too intense. He told me if I didn't take it off, he'd call the cops. This wasn't even the day of the trip. I was just there to pick up the itinerary, so I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I said, "Screw you," and left. Honestly, what kind of school goes to those lengths over a hat? Talk about power trip. Story 6. The only God is perfect rule. Alright, next up, the only God is perfect rule. This one takes the cake. The school I went to was a Catholic girls' high school, and like many religious institutions, they had some strange rules. One of the weirdest was when they decided that if you got a 100% in a class, your grade would be dropped to 99%. Why? Because according to them, only God is perfect. Now this wasn't an official rule, just something that happened once to the girl who eventually became our valedictorian, but it was still ridiculous. She got a 100% on her semester grade, and they decided to knock her down to 99%. I don't even know how to begin explaining how absurd that is. Like, the idea that perfection isn't allowed in a Catholic school is just mind-boggling. It's one of those things that makes you question the logic behind some school rules. What's the point of grading if you can't get a perfect score? Isn't that the whole point? But hey, I guess they wanted to remind us all that no one is perfect except, God. Story 7. The bizarre banned t-shirt ban. Let's talk about another truly wild rule: banned t-shirts. Specifically, one particular album cover. At my high school, students were outraged when the administration banned a t-shirt featuring the cover of Rush's album Signals. Why? Because of a dog. Yeah, you read that right. The dog was sniffing a fire hydrant, and the school deemed it scatological. Serious. The cover of an album by one of the most iconic rock bands was too inappropriate for school. Naturally, the entire student body found this rule ridiculous. So what did we do? About half of us wore the t-shirt on the same day in protest. And guess what? We won. The school had to back down. In the end, we were allowed to wear the t-shirt again. The rule was as dumb as it sounds, and it sparked one of the most absurd battles between students and administration. But looking back, it's almost hard to believe that something as innocent as a dog on an album cover could get so much attention. It made the administration look completely out of touch. And honestly, I think the whole thing was more about exerting control than any actual moral stand. Story 8. The planner problem. You know those ugly planners they give out at the start of the school year, the ones that are supposed to help keep track of your assignments, but in reality, just end up as a huge hassle? Well, at a school, we had to carry these planners everywhere. But here's the kicker. At the back of the planner, there were hall passes. That's right. If you didn't have your planner, or if all your hall pass boxes were filled up, you couldn't use the bathroom. And here's where it gets even worse. If you didn't have the planner with you, you weren't allowed to go to the bathroom at all. Imagine that. You're sitting in class, you're about to burst, and you can't go because your planner is at home. Or maybe you ran out of hall pass. The only way around it was to have a doctor's note. But good luck getting a doctor's note for a stomachache caused by the food in the cafeteria. But the kicker came when we all realized you couldn't buy a new planner if you lost it or borrowed one from a friend. Nope, the rules were strict. And to top it off, you couldn't even just go to the bathroom if it was an emergency without feeling like you were breaking some absurd school law. What a joke. Now, when you think of a college dorm, you probably picture something like a home away from home, a place where you can relax and study. Not here. At this place, they had a set of rules that made it feel more like a military camp than a college. You had to be in your room for forced study time every night. No excuses. The clock was ticking, and if you weren't in your room doing something productive, you'd be in trouble. And don't even think about sleeping in on the weekends. You had to make your bed by 9 a.m., even on Saturday. Yeah, you heard me right. 9 a.m. on weekends. I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but it just wasn't working for any of us. And then there was the towel rule. You had to keep your towels perfectly straight on the towel rack. I'm not kidding. Straight. This wasn't a suggestion. The dorm supervisors were serious about it, and there were inspections. Yeah, inspections to make sure the towels were straight and the beds were made. What did they think? That God was going to come down and check if we made our beds properly? Story 10. The fight rule. No context, no mercy. Let's circle back to one of the most frustrating rules. The no tolerance policy for fights. This one takes the cake for being completely backwards. The rule: if you were involved in any kind of physical altercation, you were automatically suspended. No questions asked. Sounds fair, right? Well, it would be, if they actually took the context into account. I got suspended once for a fight I wasn't even involved in. Some kid knocked my books out of my hands, and when I bent down to pick them up, he punched me in the face. Now let's be clear. I didn't throw a single punch, didn't kick, didn't retaliate in any way, but because I was involved, I got suspended. It didn't matter that I was the one getting punched. It didn't matter that I didn't start anything. This is the perfect example of why no tolerance policies are deeply flawed. There's no room for context, no room for understanding what actually happened. I was the victim, but I was treated like the culprit. It's so frustrating to think back on that time, and it really shows how broken some school systems can be. Story 11. The mascot controversy. Guns N' Roses t-shirt drama. Alright, one more story before we wrap up this section. Our school mascot was Daniel Boone, holding a musket. Now we all know that mascots are supposed to represent school spirit, right? But one day, a kid wore a Guns N' Roses t-shirt to school. It had pistols on it, and the school was not having it. They told him to change, saying that the pistols were inappropriate. Fair enough, right? But here's the twist. Our mascot had a musket. A musket. I mean, come on. If you're going to ban one image of a weapon, shouldn't you be consistent? The kid, being a bit cheeky, pointed out the hypocrisy of the mascot. And guess what? The school caved. They changed the mask. They switched Daniel Boone's musket for a flagpole and removed every single instance of the mascot from signs around the school and even the giant picture in the basketball stadium. But honestly, it was kind of hilarious. The school changed everything because one student aimed to point out their double standards. But in hindsight, it wasn't about the mascot or the t-shirt. It was about how the school just couldn't admit when they were wrong. Story 12. The no hats rule. The extreme anti-gang measure. Moving on to the no hats rule. You know, at most schools, there are basic dress codes, and in Indralay, hats are a simple no-no. But at my school, it was a whole they banned hats because they were apparently used to signal gang affiliations. The logic? If you wore a hat, you might be secretly part of some gang. Yeah, because that makes total sense. The biggest gang in our area. The Hells Angels. But you know what? They weren't exactly sending their kids to school in hats. So this rule was a bit over the top. But this rule didn't just end with the students. It followed me years later. I came back to volunteer as a chaperone on a school trip, and the principal spotted me wearing a beanie. He sprinted halfway across the school just to tell me to take it off. When I explained that I wasn't a student anymore and I didn't have to follow the dress code, he threatened to call the cops. At that point, I just said, "Screw you," and left. Can you imagine chasing someone down for wearing a beanie? The absurdity was off the charts. Story 13. The no godlike 100% rule in Catholic school. Now let's shift gears to something a little more religious. The only God is perfect rule. This one comes from a Catholic girls' high school. The idea behind the rule was that no one should be perfect except for God. But the real issue, it was enforced by the grading system. If you scored a perfect 100% in a class, they would dock your grade to 99%. Why? Because as the school put it, only God is perfect. I remember this happening to the girl who eventually became our valedictorian. She had earned a perfect score, but they dropped her grade because they didn't want anyone to feel too perfect. I can't even begin to explain how frustrating that was. It's a Catholic school. Didn't they realize that perfection was kind of a big deal? I guess God's perfection was reserved for him, and not for any of us mere mortals. In a way, it felt like the school was punishing us for doing well. I can understand trying to keep things humble, but docking someone's grade for being too perfect. Ridiculous. Story 14. the mascot in the Guns N' Roses incident. Back to the weird mascot situation. Our school mascot was Daniel Boone. Yes, the frontiersman, holding a musket. You'd think they'd want to avoid any weaponry, right? But nope. One day, a kid wore a Guns N' Roses shirt with pistols on it. The school flipped out, telling him to change because guns are inappropriate. But here's the thing. Our mascot had a musket. The same thing. It didn't make sense at all. When the kid pointed out the obvious hypocrisy, the school did what they always do when they can't defend their rules. They changed the mascot. Daniel Boone was no longer holding a musket. Instead, he was holding a flagpole. That's right, a flagpole. They changed every single instance of that mascot, from signs around the school to the giant painting in the basketball stadium. And just like that, the school administration tried to cover up their own mistake by erasing their own history. It's kind of hilarious, honestly. But when you think about it, the whole situation could have been handled better. The problem wasn't the t-shirt or the mascot. It was the school's inability to take a step back and evaluate what really mattered. Story 15. The God is perfect rule. Too much control over our grades. Let's get back to the strange rules around grades. At one point, they decided that even if you got a 100%, your grade would be docked by 1%. Why? Because in their words, only God is perfect. It doesn't sound like much, but for the student who earned that 100%, it was a major slap in the face. I still remember the valedictorian. She was a brilliant student, and she earned a perfect score, but the school gave her a 99% instead. And do you know the reason why? They said it was because according to their belief, perfection belonged only to God. I mean, talk about holding back students from their full potential. They couldn't even allow perfection in a student's grades, because it seemed too, well, perfect. There was something deeply flawed about that kind of rule. In hindsight, it was more about control than any real moral stance. They wanted to remind us that no one could be perfect, not even the students who excelled. Honestly, I'm just glad that ridiculous rule didn't last forever. Story 16. The mascot hypocrisy. A lesson in double standards. Remember the Daniel Boone incident? That mascot holding a musket? Well, it became a symbol of the school's double standard. The day the school flipped out over a kid wearing a Guns N' Roses shirt, they showed us exactly how far they were willing to go to keep up appearances. Instead of considering the broader issue, they just made a massive change to save. Suddenly, Daniel Boone was no longer holding a musket, but a flagpole. The hypocrisy was almost too much to bear. The school was trying to protect its image by censoring everything that seemed too controversial, but all it did was highlight how out of touch they were with reality. Honestly, it felt more like they were trying to pretend the issue didn't exist, rather than actually addressing it. But looking back, it wasn't even about the musket or the t-shirt. It was about how the school handled things when they were confronted with a challenge. Instead of having an open discussion, they chose to sweep the problem under the rug and change the mascot. And for that, I give the kid who pointed it out a lot of credit. He made the school think, even if it was just for a moment. Story 17. The no bag rule. Why haws hate bags. Now let's talk about another strange rule, the no bags rule. The idea was simple, right? Kids weren't allowed to bring their bags into class. Instead, you had to leave your bag in your locker and go between classes with just your books in hand. But this of course created a whole other set of problems. For one, imagine trying to juggle 6 or 7 textbooks and supplies as you race between classes. It was impossible, and kids ended up carrying everything in their arms, only to realize they had forgotten something important back in their locker. And that's not even the worst part. Let's talk about what happened when they tried to implement a new system of bags. The school tried to make us use these paper bags that they provided for everyone. They were flimsy, poorly made, and quite honestly, fell apart before lunch. Everyone hated it. It felt like the school was just making up rules for the sake of making rules. Eventually, after enough complaints and frustration, they gave up on this attempt at controlling students' bags. But by then, the damage was already done, and we all knew that the school had a serious problem with just letting us bring our own bags. What's the deal? Why do schools have such an issue with letting students carry their bags around? They think it's a privilege or something. In reality, it's just about control, and we all hated it. Story 18. The water bottle ban. Health becomes a punishment. Let's get to something health-related. Water bottles. Yes, you read that correctly. My school decided that a water bottle during class was against the rules. Why? Because apparently students might be sneaking in things like alcohol or drugs in their water bottles. Okay, fine. I get that they were trying to prevent some bad behavior, but here's where it gets ridiculous. They banned all water bottles. We were only allowed to drink from the school's disgusting water fountains, which everyone knew were full of germs. And if you didn't have a bottle, too bad, you were stuck. Now, if you've ever had a day where you're dehydrated and can't focus, you know how miserable it can be. My school didn't care. If you wanted to drink, you had to ask permission. Sometimes they'd let you go to the fountain, other times they wouldn't. It was basically a gamble, and for those of us with health problems, this was even worse. I'm talking about the kids who needed water or a snack to avoid fainting. It was like the school couldn't care less about our well-being. In retrospect, it seems insane that a school would rather control something as simple as a water bottle than take into account the basic needs of their students. The story 19, the ridiculous t-shirt ban. Flower patterns are dangerous. Next up, the t-shirt ban. This was straight up nonsense. So the school had a dress code, but it didn't stop there. They started enforcing this absurd rule, where no one could wear a t-shirt with a logo or imagery larger than 2 by 2 inches. Simple, right? Well, not when one of my classmates decided to wear a t-shirt with a flower pattern, and guess what? The design was just a little bit larger than the allowed size. Yep, she got sent home for wearing a flower on her shirt. A freaking flower. The school had to call her parents, and the whole thing became this absurd battle over a flower. This is the exact kind of rule that makes you question the logic behind school policies. I mean, what kind of school punishes a kid for wearing a flower pattern? It didn't even make sense. But this wasn't an isolated incident. The whole school year was full of these ridiculous little rules, designed to control what we wore. And by the end of the year, the t-shirt policy was forgotten, just like most of the other dumb rules they tried to enforce. Story 20. The tuck-in rule. Who needs comfort anyway? Now let's talk about comfort, or rather the lack of it. There was this one rule at my school, where every shirt had to be tucked in. No exceptions. It didn't matter if you were wearing jeans, basketball shorts, or a tank top. Your shirt had to be tucked in. And if it wasn't, you'd be sent home. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with anyone. Here's where it gets extra ridiculous. We had gym class, and guess what? We still had to wear a tie and a tucked-in shirt while running the mile. A freaking tie. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like something that should be enforced while you're sweating your guts out in PE. We all felt like we were trapped in a never-ending game of dress code enforcement. And the thing was, it wasn't even about looking neat. It was about making sure we followed every little rule, even when it didn't make sense. Story 21. The bizarre ban on non-white bras. Okay, this one is out of left field, but bear with. The school had this rule that only white bras were allowed. If you wore a bra that wasn't white, you would be sent home. And the worst part? It wasn't even about the color of the bra being inappropriate. It was about how it showed under a school uniform. This was just one of those rules that served no purpose other than to make girls feel like they were doing something wrong. Honestly, thinking about it now, it was just another example of how schools love to over-police students, especially female students. All of us had to make sure our bras didn't show, and if they did, get ready to get sent home. Story 22. The unseen special ed rule. This one is downright disturbing. At my school, there was this unofficial rule that became painfully obvious over time. Students in the special education program were treated like they were somehow different from the rest of us. They were escorted from class to class and weren't allowed to interact with the regular students. This wasn't written down anywhere. It was just something that we all came to note. You could see it if you paid attention. Whenever a special ed student got too close to a regular student in the hallway or classroom, a teacher would step in, practically scolding the regular student for even talking to them. It was like they were being treated as though they were somehow dangerous to us, like we couldn't be around them. And the worst part, the school did nothing about it. There were complaints, there were whispers among students, but it was ignored. It wasn't until a new principal came in that things began to change. She noticed what was going on and quietly told the teachers to stop, but it was heartbreaking to see how long it took for the issue to even be addressed. I still feel ashamed about how the school treated those students, and I wish there was more I could have done at the time. But this was especially ridiculous. No logos, no graphics that were larger than a 2 by 2 square on our clothes. Seems reasonable, right? Wrong. One day, a classmate of mine wore a shirt with an image larger than allowed, and it was a flower pattern. Yes, a flower pattern. The school insisted it violated the dress code. Now this might sound like a minor issue, but it became huge. She was sent home for it. A flower got her sent home. They even called her parents, who were obviously outraged. And you know what the worst part was? The flower pattern was just slightly over the allowed size. How is that an offense? This was the kind of petty rule that made us feel like we were constantly being policed for every little thing. It didn't even seem like the school cared about what we actually wore. They just wanted to control us in any way possible. In the end, they did drop the rule, but that didn't stop the constant barrage of other dress code infractions, none of which made sense, of course. Story 24. The no bags rule. An unnecessary power trip. Next up, No bags allowed in the classroom. You could bring your books but not your bag. No backpacks, no purses. Nothing. And it wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about control. We had to leave our bags in the locker, go between classes with just our books, and of course, if you forgot something, you had to make the long trek back to the locker to get it. But wait, it gets worse. To add insult to injury, the school decided to give us paper bags. You know, the flimsy ones that couldn't hold anything. They forced us to use them for the entire day. What was the point? Everyone hated those bags, and by lunch they were torn up and useless. But of course, the school didn't care. The teachers didn't care. All that mattered was that we followed the rule. In the end, the bag ban was quickly dropped, but that didn't stop the school from trying to control everything else. It was just another one of those ridiculous power plays that made school feel more like a prison than a place of learning. My school decided that water bottles were a dangerous thing to bring to class. The logic: students could fill their water bottles with something other than water, like alcohol or drugs. So what did they do? They banned water bottles altogether. That's right. If you wanted to drink, you had to use the school's disgusting water fountains. You couldn't even have a bottle of water in class. About taking one to the gym or bringing one for sports. I don't know if they realize this, but dehydration is a real issue. We were all in class trying to focus, and sometimes it was hard to stay awake without water. But no, if you wanted drink, you had to ask permission, and sometimes you weren't allowed to. It was so backward. The worst part was that if you had any health issues, like needing water for medication, you were out of luck. The rules didn't care about your personal needs. They didn't even care about keeping us healthy. It was just about enforcing a rule that didn't make any sense. Story 26. The tuck-in rule. No relaxing ever. Let's move on to the ridiculous rule about tucking in shirts. At this school, every single shirt had to be tucked in. Whether you were wearing jeans, skirts, or shorts, the shirt had to tucked in. And it wasn't just about looking neat. It was a control thing. The school wanted us to follow the dress code, and they weren't willing to budge, even when it made no sense. But here's where it gets absurd. We had gym class, and yes, we were expected to wear a tie and tuck our shirts in while running the mile. A tie in gym class. You can't make this up. It wasn't about looking professional or neat. It was about making us follow rules that had no real purpose, other than to annoy us. It was about taking away any sense of freedom. For example, you couldn't bring a purse unless it was the size they deemed acceptable. It was like they thought we were all going to sneak something in or show up with something that didn't fit their strict mold. It wasn't enough to follow the dress code. We had to follow their restrictions on our personal belongings too. And get this, if you had anything like chapstick or lotion, you had to get permission from the nurse to use it. It was bizarre. I get that they didn't want to have students using things inappropriately, but the constant oversight felt invasive. Who were we hurting by carrying a 80 tube of chapstick? This obsession with control and rules made the place feel less like a school and more like a prison. Story 28. The redundancy of no-logo shirts. Let's talk about logos, or rather the lack of them. For a while we were told that if our shirts had a logo bigger than a 2x2 square, we would be sent home. So naturally, kids pushed back. One of my classmates wore a shirt with a large logo on it as a protest. And of course, she got caught. It wasn't even a controversial logo. It was just a brand name. The funniest part, the school didn't really care that kids wore all sorts of ridiculous stuff outside of the dress code. If you were rich enough or liked enough, you could get away with anything. But if you were like me, just a regular kid with no connections, you could get sent home over a logo. Story 29. The school bags ban. What are we supposed to do with our stuff? Let's go on to the next absurdity. The school bag ban. Imagine going to class, having your books and notes scattered in lockers all over the place, and no bags allowed in the hallways. The school's idea would keep us from hiding things or sneaking around with forbidden items. But the problem was that it didn't make any sense. You'd have to run to your locker between classes, trying to balance textbooks, binders, and notebooks all in your arms. There was no time between classes, and the halls were too crowded for everyone to get to their lockers, so half the time you'd show up to class without the things you actually needed. It didn't make things safer or better. It just made everything more inconvenient. And then in a weird twist, they decided to solve this issue by handing out paper bags. Yes, paper bags, because that's exactly what we needed to carry our books and materials around. They tore easily, didn't hold anything, and were pretty much useless by lunch. The whole thing was an exercise in frustration, and yet the school pushed this for the longest time until eventually, students just ignored it. I mean, how could they not? Story 30. The zero tolerance for phones. Really? You know the whole zero tolerance thing, the one where you get in trouble for even the smallest offense. Well, at my school it applied to phones. If you were caught using your phone at all, even for something as simple as checking the time, it would get taken away for the day. And if you didn't hand it over immediately, you'd get detention. One time, a teacher saw a friend of mine checking the time on her phone as we were walking out of school. We weren't even in class, and we weren't disrupting anything. But the teacher saw her and immediately started yelling at her, demanding she hand over the phone. Even when my friend tried to explain that she was just checking the time, something that could have easily been done with a watch, the teacher insisted on confiscating it. That wasn't the worst part though. The worst part was that she had to hand it over to the teacher and get punished for something that had no impact on anyone else. It felt like the school had nothing better to do than control what little freedom we had left. Story 31. The no talking during lunch rule. Imagine being told you couldn't talk during lunch. Yep, no talking. It might sound like something out of a dystopian novel, but that was the rule at my school. They had these bizarre stoplight systems in the lunchroom. If the lights turned red, you couldn't speak. If you did, you'd lose a portion of your lunch break as punishment. The school thought this would somehow make us more disciplined or focused, but all it did was make us all feel like we were in some sort of authoritarian regime. And what happened when the lights turned red? We all had to eat in total silence, and if you dared to speak, even for a moment, you'd get punished. The best part, the lunch break was only 15 minutes long, so taking 5 minutes away for being too loud just made things more stressful. Instead of enjoying lunch and relaxing, we were all forced to sit in silence, watching the clock tick down as our break was cut short. Story 32. The zero tolerance for bullying, except when it came to teachers. We've all heard of zero tolerance policies, especially when it comes to bullying. The thing is, at my school, that rule was enforced only when students were involved. If a student was being bullied, the school would jump in immediately, making sure they were disciplined. But when a teacher was bullying a student, nothing. Absolutely nothing. I saw it firsthand. One teacher in particular had a habit of belittling students in front of the entire class. She'd make cutting remarks, embarrass students, and even get physical by grabbing kids' arms or pushing them to sit down. Yet, when anyone complained or tried to speak up, nothing was done. The teachers had a special privilege that protected them from any form of punishment. It made me question how effective the school's bullying policies really were. If a teacher could treat a student that way, what was stopping other students from doing the same thing? This double standard was one of the most frustrating aspects of my school experience. Story 33. The phone confiscation policy. Even after school hours. Let's go back to phones for a second. The rule at my school was clear. If you were caught on your phone anywhere on school grounds, including after school, you'd get it confiscated. Yes, even if you were just outside, hanging waiting for your parents to pick you up and checking the time. That happened to one of my friends. She had just finished an after-school club, and her parents were running late. She checked the time on her phone as she was standing outside, and a teacher saw her. Guess what's happened next? Her phone got confiscated, and this wasn't some harmless oops moment. The teacher kept her phone until the end of the day, and if you didn't hand it over, you were sent to detention. This absurd policy made zero sense, especially since we weren't even inside the building anymore. But the teacher didn't. It was one of those power plays where the school just wanted to make sure they were controlling every aspect of our lives. Story 34. The absurd school planner punishment. I don't know about you, but planners always seemed like a great way to keep track of assignment. But at my school, the planner wasn't just about keeping track of work, it became a punishment tool. If you didn't have your planner signed by your parents every single week, you'd get detention. It didn't matter if you had straight A's or if you had an excuse. It was what's the planner's signature. But at my school, the planner wasn't just about keeping track of work. It became a punishment tool. If you didn't have your planner signed, then I was hit with a 15-minute detention for every single thing I missed. That's right, I had detention for hours just because I didn't get my planner signed. And it wasn't even the first time I had detention for something as petty as that. It felt like the school was just looking for any excuse to punish us, even for the smallest things. Story 35. The dress code double standard. One of the most frustrating things at my school was the blatant double standard when it came to enforcing the dress code. If you were a problem student, they'd be all over you about every little thing. But if you were one of the favorites, whether it was because you had money, were popular, or just had the right connections, you could get away with murder, fashion-wise. There was this one girl, whose parents made hefty donations to the school. She had this wild rainbow mohawk and got away with it for months. Not a single teacher said a word. Meanwhile, if I had the slightest deviation from the dress code, like a shirt with an inch-wide logo, or a pair of boots that weren't approved for school, I'd be sent straight to the principal's office. But she never even got a warning. It wasn't fair, and everyone knew it. It just went to show how much favoritism existed. For the rest of us, it felt like we were constantly walking on eggshells, while a select few got to do whatever they wanted. It felt like the school cared more about appearances than actual rules. Story 36. The no facial hair rule. Here's a classic case of overreaching. No facial hair for boys. Why? Because apparently it was distracting at first. I thought this rule was a joke. But nope, this was a real thing. If you were a guy, you had to be clean shaven at all times. It didn't matter if you had a little scruff or just wanted to grow a beard. It was against the rules. And the worst part, teachers didn't just warn you about it. If you showed up with a bit of stubble or facial hair, you'd get sent home. But you know what's even crazy? Teachers themselves were allowed to have facial hair. Male teachers would walk around with perfectly styled beards while students were being sent home for having any facial hair at all. It was yet another example of how the school was just creating arbitrary rules without any real logic behind them. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure how a little facial hair is a distraction when we were in a school full of bigger problems. It just felt like a power play, another way the school could control us. Story 37. The no water during exams rule. Here's one that was truly ridiculous. During exams, we weren't allowed to drink water. Sounds insane, right? Well, it wasn't just any exam. It was during a heat wave, and the classrooms didn't have air conditioning. Imagine being in a classroom with no ventilation, sweating, concentrating hard, and you're not allowed to drink water. If you had a water bottle, it would be confiscated. This happened during one of the hottest weeks of the year. The temperature was unbearable, and we were stuck in classrooms, forced to take an exam, while dehydrated. I remember one of my friends fainting halfway through an exam. She had been so thirsty, but the rule didn't budge. No water, no exceptions. What was the logic behind this? They thought students might cheat with their water bottles. It wasn't about cheating. It was about basic health and comfort. I can't believe they didn't consider how dangerous it was to not let kids drink during a heat wave. Story 38. The locker room double standard. Let's talk about locker rooms and gym class. At my school, if you were a girl, you couldn't have gym class at the same time as the boys. Why? Because heaven forbid, a boy and a girl might see each other in gym shorts. So what did they do? They scheduled gym class so that the boys and girls had completely separate times. This wasn't even about comfort or practicality. It was just another example of the school trying to create some artificial barrier between the genders. And if you were ever caught in the hallway near the locker rooms when the boys were coming out, you'd be scolded, like you'd done something wrong. It didn't make any sense. Boys and girls could share classrooms, but when it came to gym class, we had to be kept apart. It felt like they were treating us like we were incapable of handling basic interactions. What did they think would happen if we crossed paths on the way to the locker rooms? It was a bizarre rule that didn't help anyone. Story 39. The no phones after school rule. Now let's talk about the phone rules again. I know we've covered phones before, but this one deserves its own spot. At my school, phones were strictly forbidden, even after school hours. Sounds harsh, right? But here's the kicker. Even if you were just standing outside, waiting for your parents and you happened to check your phone, it was considered a violation of the rules. One time, a friend of mine was standing behind the school gates, just checking the time on her phone, and a teacher saw her. They immediately told her to hand over the phone, even though she wasn't using it for anything disruptive. The teacher didn't care about the context. The rule was the rule. It didn't matter if you were waiting for a ride home, just casually checking your messages, or looking at the time. If you were on your phone, it got confiscated. It didn't even make sense. It was just another one of those rules that was about power, not practicality. Story 40. The inconsistent consequences for dress code violations. Speaking of dress code violations, here's a real kicker. I was punished for wearing a black shirt under my collared shirt. Sounds harmless, right? Well, apparently it wasn't, because I got sent home for it. And here's the thing. This wasn't an official rule. It was just a way for certain teachers to get you for something, especially if they didn't like you. On the other hand, a rich kid with a rainbow mohawk, no problem. They didn't. It was just one more example of how students with money or connections got away with everything. They could literally break every rule and get away with it, while the rest of us were punished for the smallest things. It was frustrating and felt incredibly unfair. Story 41. The gender-specific seating rule. Now let's talk about a truly infuriating rule. Gender-specific seating. This was one of those rules that made you wonder what century you were living in. In my school, boys and girls weren't allowed to sit together. Ever. It didn't matter if you were friends or if you just wanted to sit next to someone in class. You were forced to stay apart. They hired disciplinarians to roam the school and make sure that no boy and girl sat together. If you were found in violation of this rule, you'd get a reprimand. Keep doing it, and you'd get sent to the principal's office. It didn't take long for students to start making jokes about it. We'd secretly pass notes or whisper to each other across the classroom because honestly, this rule was just stupid. But here's where it gets really frustrating. When we went to complain about it, we were told, it's just how things are. When we talked to our parents, they were equally furious but didn't know what to do. You could just imagine the level of absurdity that ensued when everyone realized this was the hill the school was willing to die on. It wasn't just a rule. It felt like an unnecessary petty power trip. Story 42, the no backpacks rule. In middle school, here's another classic rule that made zero sense: no backpacks allowed in the hallways. How are you supposed to carry your books if you don't have a backpack? Simple. You have to walk around with all your stuff in your arms, which is both inconvenient and unrealistic. It wasn't just annoying, it was completely impractical. At a middle school with 8 classes a day, we had 3 minutes between each class. And guess, that was barely enough time. Go to your locker and get everything you needed. So instead of being allowed to carry your backpack and have your books in one place, you had to juggle your textbooks, binders, and everything else while running down the hall. Of course, this led to more chaos because kids were constantly forgetting something and having to go back to their lockers. They finally gave in and relaxed the rule by my last year in middle school. But by then, we'd all learned how to sneak things around under our jackets or in our sleeves, and the whole no backpacks rule was just an inconvenience. Story 43, the must be in the cafeteria rule. For lunch. This next rule just made lunch that much harder. At my school, we had to eat lunch in the main hall. No eating in the classroom, no eating in the hallway, and definitely no eating on the field during breaks. The only way to eat in the main hall was to buy food from the cafeteria. So if you didn't buy the school lunch, tough luck, you were stuck eating in the cafeteria with nowhere else to go. It sounds trivial, right? But it really became an issue when the cafeteria was overcrowded with younger kids, leaving older students with no place to sit. It was a frustrating experience, and it created unnecessary tension between the group. We started sneaking food into class, or sneaking outside to eat on the field, because we were so tired of the overcrowded cafeteria, and always being forced to stay within that tiny noisy space. Eventually, after enough complaints, they allowed us to eat outside. But by then, the damage was done. It was just another example of how some of the rules felt more about control than practical solution. Story 44. The no play rule for sports in the mini golf incident. Now this one is a bit more unusual. We weren't allowed to play mini golf during recess. This wasn't just any mini golf setup, either. The school had these cool concrete animals on the playground that looked like fun to play on. But no, we weren't allowed to touch them. Why? Apparently because they didn't want us to destroy them. These things were literally made of concrete. They were indestructible. So what did the school do? They just banned us from touching them at all. And we couldn't even use them during gym class for fun because they were deemed off limits. Of course, that rule lasted until the high school seniors were given permission to bring sledgehammers and smash them to pieces. Yeah, you read that right. The same school that wouldn't let us play mini golf was fine with letting the seniors destroy the playground. It was a weird backwards policy, and looking back it makes absolutely no sense. Story 45, the rule against running. Because apparently it was too dangerous, this rule deserves its own spotlight. No running. Yeah, that's right. At my school, running was forbidden, not just in the hallways or the classrooms, all over the school grounds. Why? Apparently it was too dangerous. Students running during break or PE class, you couldn't do it. They even banned any ball sports, soccer, football, you name it. But here's the kicker. After this rule was put in place, the school still allowed frisbee. I'm not kidding. They banned running, but were totally okay with us throwing a frisbee around. You can probably imagine how ridiculous it was to see teenagers skipping around playing frisbee during PE, when everyone else was just trying to get some energy out. When the rule finally started to fade away, we were all relieved. It's crazy that something as basic as running was banned at school, but it was just one of many strange policies that we all had to live through. Story 46, the no logo rule. Being sent home for a shirt. Here's another one that took the cake. The no logo rule. At my school, we weren't allowed to wear shirts with logos larger than a 2x2 square. You could wear a t-shirt, but if your logo was bigger than that, one of my classmates learned this the hard way. She wore a shirt with a larger logo on it, and guess what happened? She got sent home. And why? Because the logo was too big. Now this wasn't a controversial logo, and it didn't promote anything inappropriate. It was just a brand name. But no, the school enforced their rule to the letter. It was just another example of how the dress code was designed to make kids feel like they were always walking on eggshells. If you weren't one of the rich kids or the teacher's favorites, you could get sent home over the smallest of dress code infractions. Story 47, the no phones in school rule. not even for emergencies. Let's talk about phones again, because this rule really takes the cake. Our school had a strict no phones rule, and it applied to literally every scenario. The catch: it didn't even matter if you needed your phone for something important, like an emergency. If you were caught on your phone even just for a quick second, it would be confiscated. One time, a student's parent was the hospital, and they needed to be available in case anything urgent came up. So naturally, they kept their phone with them. But the teacher saw the phone, took it away, and refused to give it back until the end of the day. The student was then unable to contact their parents in the middle of an emergency, all because of this stupid rule. To top it off, even if we needed to check something as simple as the time, forget it. You'd get a detention or worse. You couldn't use it to check homework or even pull up a calculator if you forgot one. It was a total overstep, and no one could really understand what the school was trying to achieve. They just wanted control. The rules didn't seem to care that we were actual human beings with lives outside of school. They treated us like machines that needed to follow orders. No questions asked. Story 48, the you can't wear what you want rule. And now, let's talk about a rule that made no sense at all. The you can't wear what you want rule. At my school, there was a strange rule where we weren't allowed to wear anything that didn't fit the school's idea of uniform. So if you wore anything that didn't meet the exact criteria, whether it was a slightly off-brand shirt or a pair of shoes that weren't on the approved list, you'd get in trouble. And I'm not talking about breaking a rule on a technicality. They went as far as sending you home if they didn't. Your outfit. One day, I was wearing a shirt that had a very small logo on the sleeve. I thought it was subtle enough, but nope, it was against the dress code. When I got to class, the teacher sent me home because of that tiny logo. I was furious. It wasn't even visible unless you looked closely, but of course the school was all about these little details, thinking they were doing us a favor by enforcing rules that literally no one cared about. The real kicker was you couldn't even get away with it if you were a good student. If you were one of the problem students, forget it. Rules would be enforced to the letter. I've never understood why schools were so obsessed with controlling what we wore rather than just letting us be. At my school, we were given these planners that were supposed to help us keep track of homework assignments. However, if we forgot to get a parent's signature for an assignment, it was treated like a major crime. I'll never forget the time I ended up with 3.5 hours of detention just because I didn't get my planner signed for the week. It was honestly insane. I had straight A's and never had any major issues in class. But because I forgot to get my planner signed, I was punished. And the worst part, I was stuck in detention alone for 3 hours with no one around, just stewing in frustration. And for what? Because of a piece of paper that didn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. This rule didn't teach me anything except how absurd and petty school rules could be. I wasn't learning any valuable lessons from being punished over something so trivial, and I still remember the day I was in detention, thinking, this is so stupid. Story 50, the dress code drama, when logos were a crime. Remember when we talked about logo? Here's a fun one. If you wore anything with a logo on it, larger than 2 by 2 inches, you'd be sent home. It wasn't even about what the logo represented. It was about how big it was. Really, this is what we were being sent home for. A logo. I remember one of my friends wore a shirt that had a small logo on the chest, and the teacher made a huge deal out of it. They told her to go to the principal's office immediately. When my friend protested, pointing out that it was just a logo and not a gang symbol or anything inappropriate, the teacher didn't care. She still got sent home simply because the shirt had a logo that was slightly bigger than the allowed size. It was beyond frustrating, and when we tried to talk to the principal about it, they just shrugged and said, "It's the rule." It was mind-blowing that something so small could be such a big deal. But hey, that's how the school operated. Small rules, big punishment. Story 51, the sitting in the lunchroom rule. Here's another one that took the pointless rules crown, where we were allowed to sit at lunch. Apparently in our school, the rule was that you had to sit in the lunchroom if you wanted to eat there. You couldn't sit anywhere else, even though the entire school had plenty of other spaces to eat. What made it even worse? The students weren't even allowed to sit in their preferred spots. You had to sit in the designated student section, with no choice about who you sat next to. So, if you didn't like a certain group, tough luck. You were forced to sit with them anyway, and if you tried to sneak somewhere else to sit, you were reprimanded. The whole thing felt like a constant reminder that you had no control over your own lunch break. Story 52, the locker inspection rule. Now, let's get to lockers, but not in the way you might think. At my school, lockers were treated as if they were off limits, unless you had a really good reason. You couldn't just go to your locker between classes without some sort of explanation. And worst of all, they actually inspected our lockers. Yes, They would just walk in and check to see if anything inappropriate was inside. The worst part was the complete lack of privacy. Imagine having to explain why you had a book in your locker that wasn't on the approved reading list. Or maybe you had a snack that wasn't approved by the school. You could get in trouble for the silliest things, and they had no problem violating your personal space to make sure you weren't breaking any rules. Story 53. The no backpacks rule. A bag full of problems. Here's a rule that really got under my skin. The no backpacks rule. Imagine a school day where you're running between classes, trying to carry all your textbooks, notebooks, and supplies with you, and no bag to help. Yep, that was the reality for us. We weren't allowed to carry backpacks or any bags around. Everything had to be left in your locker. The problem? The school was huge. We had 8 classes a day, and we barely had time to run from one class to the next. It was a nightmare. The halls were overcrowded, and no one had time to go back their lockers in between classes. You had to carry all your books, your lunch, and anything else you needed in your arms. And the worst part, if you forgot something, tough luck. You'd have to carry extra stuff for the rest of the day. Eventually, they dropped the rule, but the damage was done. We spent years dealing with unnecessary hassle just to follow a rule that made no sense. Story 54. The mascot hypocrisy weaponized double standards. Okay, let's take a trip back to the absurd mascot drama. So our school mascot was Daniel Boone, but instead of a friendly little musket, he was holding a rifle. Well, one day, a student wore a Guns N' Roses shirt with pistols on it. The school went crazy, telling him to change the shirt. Now you can imagine the irony when this same school had a mascot literally holding a weapon. The student called them out, pointing out the obvious hypocrisy, and guess what? The school completely caved. They changed the mascot overnight, replacing the musket with a flagpole. And just like that, the mascot's image was scrubbed from the school and the picture in the basketball stadium was updated. It was both hilarious and tragic. I mean, the school couldn't even acknowledge when it was clearly in the wrong. The student had made a valid point, and they couldn't handle it. So instead of addressing the hypocrisy, they just erased it. Classic school logic at its finest. Story 55. The inconsistent punishments for the dress code. And here's another dress code nightmare. The punishments for violating it were totally inconsistent. If you were a troublemaker, you were sent to the principal's office for even the tiniest infraction. But if you were a teacher's pet, or had money, you could wear whatever you wanted. One day, I was called out for a very minor dress code violation. I had a flower on my pants, slightly bigger than allowed. I was sent home because of a flower. Meanwhile, a rich kid wore a full-on rainbow mohawk for months without any issues. The school was absolutely fine with it. But the second I broke a rule, I was punished. This double standard made school feel like it wasn't about following the rules, but about making sure the right students got special treatment. I felt like I was always walking a fine line, while others just breezed through. Story 56. The no water rule. During exams. Hydration or not, here's one that will make you shake your head. During exams, we were banned bringing in water bottles. Yes, even during a heat wave. The reasoning? Apparently they thought some students might use the water bottles to So what did they do? They just banned everyone from bringing in any kind of water bottle. No exceptions. We were stuck in overheated classrooms sweating buckets, unable to hydrate, and for what? Because the school was worried about someone sneaking in a cheat sheet in their bottle. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was dangerous. The heat was unbearable, and the lack of water made it impossible to focus. One of my friends passed out during an exam because of it. Yet, the school didn't care. Nothing could make them realize how damaging that rule was. Story 57. The only certain doors rule. Let's talk about the only certain doors rule. It sounds odd, but that's exactly what we had. You see, the school had about 1,000 students, and there were multiple entrances to the building. But the problem, we weren't allowed to use all of them. You could only use one entrance in the cafeteria, which was conveniently located at the far end of the building. The other doors, off-limits, and even the doors were right next to the cafeteria, and could have helped alleviate the crowds. We were stuck using just one. This led to huge bottlenecks as students tried to squeeze through the single set of doors during lunch breaks. Buses used the back doors, but if you walked in the front, it was a maze. All of this would have been avoided if the school had just allowed us to use all the doors. It wasn't about safety, it wasn't about order, it was just another control tactic by the administration, trying to make us follow rules that had zero logical reasoning behind them. Story 58. The no bags rule, too much control. Let's circle back to another one of my favorites, the no bags rule. The idea was that no student could carry a bag around school. It sounds simple, right? But it caused so many problems. You had to leave everything in your locker, and when you switched classes, you'd carry everything in your arms. If you needed something from your locker during the day, tough luck. You were stuck carrying everything until you had time to go back. It was just as ridiculous as it sounds. The halls were crowded, we were running late to class, and no one could keep their stuff organized. The whole thing felt like a way to make school harder than it needed to be. But honestly, it was more about control than anything else. The school wanted to keep us constantly on edge and worried about forgetting something, which only caused unnecessary stress. Story 59. The girls can't wear leggings rule. Next up, leggings. Yes, we had a strict rule about leggings. If a girl wore leggings to school, it had to be covered with a long shirt, or else she would be sent home. For some reason, the school was obsessed with making sure no skin was visible. They acted like leggings were the worst thing in the world, and if they were too tight or revealing, you'd be punished. It didn't matter that some girls wore them because they were comfortable. It was all about the school's modesty standards. Of course, no one cared about the boys' dress code. They could wear whatever they wanted, including shorts that were way too short. But girls had to deal with these ridiculous rules. It was just another example of how the school focused way too much on controlling girls' bodies and not enough on actual learning or fairness. So at my school, there was a rule that students couldn't sit down during lunch unless the whole group was silent. Yeah, you read that right. You couldn't even sit down to eat until you were 100%. So imagine a bunch of hungry students standing around waiting for everyone to quiet down so they could sit. This lasted until the lunch supervisor gave the okay to finally sit down. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was awkward. Some of us would just stand there like zombies, waiting for the signal to sit, while everyone around us murmured about how stupid the rule was. The whole thing just felt like one big ridiculous power play from the staff. And to make matters worse, if someone broke the silence, the entire group had to stand up and wait to try again. Story 61. The tampon and chapstick ban. Because health is a crime, here's a rule that made no sense at all. The tampon and chapstick ban. Yeah, that's right. If you needed something like a tampon, chapstick, or lotion during the school day, you had to get a nurse's pass to use it. And not just that, you had to use it in the nurse's office, away from the rest of the students. Apparently, they thought that if you had access to chapstick or any health-related items, you might be misusing them. It was ridiculous. I get it. If a school wants to make sure that kids aren't sneaking anything, but chapstick, really, you're had to monitor how much chapstick someone uses during the day. It felt like a complete violation of personal freedom. And tampons, we're talking about basic hygiene. They made a mountain out of a molehill and turned something completely natural into a source of shame. Story 62. The no phones for schoolwork rule. Back to phones for a second. There was a wild rule at my school where phones weren't allowed to be used for anything, including schoolwork. You couldn't even use your phone to look up homework, take a quick photo of a textbook page, or check an answer online. But here's where it gets even worse. If you were caught, the school would confiscate your phone and give you detention. One time, I used my phone to take a quick picture of a homework assignment that I couldn't finish because I was running late. Guess what happened? My phone got confiscated. And you know what? I was punished for using it to get the homework done. I wouldn't even explain the context. I was treated like I was committing some huge offense when all I did was try to stay on top of my work. Story 63. The ridiculous no logos rule. There was this one teacher who took the no logos rule to the next level. If you had a shirt with a logo or a brand name on it, even something as simple as a small logo on your collar, you'd get sent home. I remember getting sent home because I wore a shirt with a tiny Nike logo on the sleeve. It wasn't a big logo, just a small one. The whole thing felt like a joke. The teachers would call out students wearing these tiny logos, but meanwhile, they let other kids who were way more openly breaking dress codes slide. If you were one of the collar kids, or your parents donated money to the school, they didn't care if you wore a shirt with a massive logo. It made absolutely no sense, and it didn't teach us anything meaningful about following rules or dressing appropriately. It just created a ton of useless drama over something so trivial. I just couldn't get over how obsessed the school was with this adverse dress code rule. Story 66. The no talking to the opposite gender rule. This one really ticked me off. The rule about not talking to the opposite gender. At my school, if you were a boy and a girl were talking, even just a casual conversation, you could be reprimanded for it. It wasn't even about how you were talking, it was just about the fact that you were talking. And I get it. It's important to maintain order, but this rule went too far. Boys and girls couldn't even sit next to each other in class without getting a warning. It made no sense. And when we complained to the principal, they just brushed it off like it was no big deal. We weren't allowed to talk, share notes, or even hang out without being accused of doing something wrong. Looking back, it's insane to think that in high school, we were so restricted, in terms of our interactions with each other. We were supposed to be mature young adults, but they treated us like we couldn't handle basic human interaction. It was one of the dumbest rules I encountered. Story 66. The no sitting during lunch rule. Okay, so here's another lunch-related rule. If we were eating lunch, we weren't allowed to sit down until the entire cafeteria was silent. That's right, silent. You couldn't even talk to your friend. If a single group of students broke the silence, everyone had to stand up and wait until they were quiet again. I'm not exaggerating. It felt like total control. Everyone was just sitting there, staring at each other, silently waiting to be allowed to sit. The worst, when we were finally allowed to sit down, half the time we had to leave 5 minutes early, so that the next class could have their turn in the cafeteria. So we got our lunch breaks cut short, all for the sake of silence. It didn't make anyone more disciplined. All it did was make lunch miserable. And somehow this rule was one of the most beloved by the administrators. Story 66. The gym dress code double standard. Here's a funny one. The dress code in gym class. It was serious business. Unless, of course, you were a guy. If you were a girl, you couldn't wear tank tops unless they were modest enough. Yet boys were allowed to wear whatever they wanted. No restrictions. I remember getting in trouble once because my tank top was just slightly above my shoulder. The teacher told me I needed to go change or get detention. Meanwhile, some of the guys were showing up in shirts that were way too tight or too short, but they didn't get reprimanded. It was so frustrating. If I could wear whatever I wanted for gym class, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But they really made a point of policing girls' bodies while giving the guys free rein. That made me feel like my education, and even my comfort, didn't matter as much as making sure the boys felt comfortable. Story 67. The rejection of self-expression through fashion. This next story is about the ridiculous restrictions on how we could express ourselves through fashion. The school had this absurd rule where you couldn't wear anything outside of the approved colors. Basically, everything had to match the school's theme of dullness. So forget about wearing a bright color or something fun to class. If you did, you'd get dinged. I remember one time I wore a pink t-shirt under my school-approved sweater, thinking it'd just add a bit of personality to my outfit. Well, guess what happened? I got sent home because pink wasn't one of the approved colors. It was like they were trying to squash any kind of individuality in the name of uniformity. It wasn't even a distracting color. It was just pink. And the worst part, the school didn't have any real explanation for the rule. It was just there to limit our ability to express ourselves. What's worse, a few fetters who were favorites could wear whatever they wanted, and we were forced to follow a rule that made no sense. Story 68. The lunch line rule that wasn't a rule. Now, here's a funny one that's also frustrating. There was this rule that didn't officially exist, but you were punished if you broke it. It was about the lunch line. You were only allowed to stand in one line to get food, and it wasn't based on what you wanted. It was based on what someone else deemed appropriate for you. I remember the first time I tried to grab a lunch tray that wasn't in the right line. Boom. A teacher stepped in and made me go all the way back to the correct line, even though it was just the same food. The entire system was set up so that students would have to get in a certain line to buy lunch, even though no one cared about what food you wanted to eat. It wasn't about the food. It wasn't about order. It was just about making sure we followed orders to make the school feel like it was in charge. The real kicker, the entire cafeteria system was always chaotic, no matter how much we followed the rules. Story 69. The bathroom sign-in disaster. I swear, it felt like every time I needed to go to the bathroom, there was a new rule to follow. In my school, you couldn't just leave class to use the bathroom. Oh no, you had to sign in and sign out. Which sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. The catch. You could only leave during certain times, and if you didn't sign out properly, you'd get marked as skipping class. And of course, the bathroom passes were limited. If there was a sign-up sheet and all the spots were taken, you were left holding your bladder and hoping for the best. On top of that, if you were caught leaving class during the wrong time, even if it was an emergency, you'd get detention. And no one could give a solid explanation as to why this rule existed, other than to keep track of who was in the classroom. The absurd part, we were treated like kids, unable to make our own decisions. It didn't teach us responsibility. It just made us feel like prisoners of a weird system that didn't make sense. Story 70. The unspoken no running rule. Okay, so this one really took the cake for stupidity. The school decided that running during breaks was forbidden. That's right, running on the playground. It wasn't just for the younger kids. It was for everyone, all the way up to high school. We weren't allowed to run for fear we might get hurt, because apparently running was just too dangerous. I'll never forget the first time we were told we weren't allowed to play a game of tag, or even run for a sports class. Warm-up. What was the reasoning? You guessed it. Safety. Because the school had to protect us from ourselves, it seemed. What ended up happening was that all the students got creative. We found ways to sneak around the rule, finding any excuse to run because, well, we were teenagers. What were they thinking? Trying to stop us from something so normal. It wasn't only ridiculous, it was also just impractical. Kids need to get some energy out. Trying to stop us from running created an atmosphere where it felt like we couldn't even enjoy the simplest things. Story 71, the boys and girls can't sit together rule. Now here's a rule that felt like it was pulled straight out of the 1950s. No boys and girls allowed to sit together in school. For some bizarre reason, this rule was enforced during lunch and even in certain classrooms. There was no reason for it. It wasn't even about respect or keeping things appropriate. It was just about control. So naturally, the students would start to find loopholes. We'd try to sit in pairs without the teachers noticing. And you know what happened? It got us into trouble, every single time. I remember sneaking in a conversation with a friend who was a girl. The next thing I knew, the teacher came over, pointing out that we were violating the no boys and girls together rule. It made zero sense. Why was this still a thing? We were all treated like kids who didn't know how to manage friendships, even though we were high schoolers. I guess the school thought this archaic rule would somehow keep us in check. Newsflash, all it did was breed resentment. Story 72, the no school bag rule. For lunch, this one is another bag-related nightmare. My school decided that no bags were allowed in the lunchroom, period. It didn't matter if you were carrying lunch, your books, or your personal item. If you brought a bag, you had to leave it outside the lunchroom and hope it was still there when you were done eating. So what happened? The bags were piled outside unattended, and some of the students, especially the younger ones, had their bags stolen or misplaced. It wasn't just impractical, it was unsafe. It created more problems than it solved. Students had to leave their items in a crowded hallway with no supervision, and it only took one bad day for someone's belongings to disappear. Story 73, the dress code double standards for boys and girls. Now let's talk about dress code double standards again, because this one is just too good in the worst way. My school had this rule that girls had to wear skirts that were at least 4 inches below the knee. Seems harmless enough, right? Wrong. Girls were constantly being sent home for not meeting that exact standard, while the boys could wear whatever they wanted, shorts above the knee, t-shirts, and no one said a word. But the real kicker, the school would make the girls go home and change while boys could get away with any kind of shorts, as long as they weren't too baggy, and no one cared. This was one of those why does this even exist rules that made school life way harder than it needed to be. Instead of letting us carry our bags and books in a backpack, we had to leave everything in our locker. Now that sounds manageable, until you realize that we only had 3 minutes between classes, and the lockers were often far from the classrooms. So what did we end up doing? Juggling our textbooks, notebooks, and all sorts of supplies in our arms. If you forgot something, you'd be late to class, and if you ran back to the locker, you'd miss half of the lecture. And because we couldn't take our bags with us, we had to carry everything. Books, lunch, pencils, like we were walking around with a personal library and a grocery store in our arms. The absurd part was that there was no real reason for the rule. We weren't a threat with backpacks. We didn't need to be treated like we were doing something wrong for carrying the very things that made school possible. It was just another unnecessary power move, designed to make us feel like we had no control over our own space. Girls, here's a story about dress code enforcement that will make your blood boil. In my school, the dress code was enforced much more strictly for the girls than for the boys. If you wore a skirt that was a little too short, or a top that didn't cover your shoulders enough, bam, you were sent home to change. But if the boys were caught with shirts that were too short, or pants that were too tight, they were either given a warning or allowed to change on their own time. The worst part, it wasn't even about modesty. It was about making sure that girls stayed within the lines and weren't allowed to express themselves. Meanwhile, the boys, they could do whatever they want. This led to a lot of confusion among students, especially the girls, who were constantly told they couldn't wear something they liked just because it didn't fit some arbitrary standard that didn't apply to the boys. Story 76, the ridiculous, you can't eat here rule. The school had this bizarre rule that you couldn't eat anywhere except the cafeteria. That meant, if you brought your own lunch or snacks, you had to eat them in the cafeteria, and only in the cafeteria. There were designated eating zones, but they were all clumped together in one tiny area. I remember trying to eat my lunch in peace, sitting on the grass outside just trying to get some fresh air. But the second a staff member saw me, they told me I was violating the no eating outside the cafeteria rule, and made me leave. What was the harm? I wasn't disturbing anyone, but the rule was about controlling where we could eat. It wasn't for any logical reason, just another pointless way to make students feel like they couldn't do anything without permission. The icing on the cake, We were also forced to buy lunch if we wanted to sit at the tables in the cafeteria. So if you brought your own food, you had to sit outside on the floor. While kids who bought lunch were treated like royalty inside the cafeteria, there was no reasoning behind it. It was all about the school's need to have control over where and how we ate. Story 77. The no food rule in classrooms. This one is a classic. No food allowed in the classroom. Not even water. That's right. You couldn't even bring a bottle of water to class. The rule was set in place to prevent distractions, but it was so over the top and unnecessary that it almost defied logic. The classrooms were hot, the air was dry, and it was during the middle of summer. Yet, we couldn't even bring a water bottle. It felt like the school was actively trying to make us uncomfortable. We were allowed to drink water, but only during breaks and lunch. The rest of the time, suck it up. If you were thirsty, you had to wait until the next break, which, let's face it, could be hours away. I can't tell you how many times I felt like passing out from dehydration. But you weren't allowed to bring a drink into class, even if it was just water. Story 78. The no fun allowed rule. This is one of the most frustrating ones. Our school had a policy that took all the fun out of any event. Whether it was a sports day, a talent show, or a club meeting, fun was not allowed. We were told that everything had to be educational, even if it had absolutely nothing to do with learning. For example, we had a talent show once, and instead of celebrating the creativity of the students, it became this strict, don't have too much fun event. No loud music, no costumes, it was basically an attempt to make us feel like every activity had to have an educational purpose, even when it was just a fun way to blow off steam or show off talents that weren't academic. It wasn't just the events. The entire spirit of the school was drained by this mentality. If you tried to enjoy something, you were reminded that everything had to have a purpose. The fun part was just not allowed. It was suffocating. Story 79. The ridiculous mascot changes. So I went to a school where the mascot was a bulldog, a fierce, proud, lovable bulldog. But one day, some genius decided that the bulldog wasn't appropriate anymore. They said it was too aggressive and might give off the wrong message to the student. In a series of meetings, they decided to completely change the mascot to something that represented peace or inclusivity, whatever that meant. The new mascot? A fluffy sheep. Yeah, you read that right. A sheep. They decided that a dog was too aggressive, so they switched to a peaceful sheep. This entire process was ridiculous. The change wasn't based on any real concern. It was just about trying to appease everyone and make the mascot soft. It didn't make sense, and it took away all the spirit that the school had. Everyone hated it, but they stuck with it because it was the new direction they were going in. Story 80. The no pockets rule. In PE, if you've ever had a PE uniform that didn't allow you to carry anything, you'll understand this next one. The no pockets rule. Yes, our PE uniforms didn't allow us to have pockets, and the reasoning behind this, apparently they were afraid we might put chewing gum or candy in our pockets during class. But it didn't stop there. There was no reason given for why we couldn't have pockets, other than the chewing gum excuse, which was completely ludicrous. Everyone knew it was a stupid rule, and honestly we just wanted to have a pocket for basic things. It made it harder to bring things we needed like tissues or a handkerchief, and just felt like another way to make us feel like we were constantly being watched. Now that you've seen all these insane rules that left us all scratching our heads, let's talk about the real impact. These rules didn't just make school a miserable experience, they killed any sense of freedom we had. We weren't treated like students, we were treated like prisoners of a system that thrived on control, fear, and conformity. The dress codes, the lunch rules, the no running ban, they weren't just inconvenient, they were designed to break our spirits and force us into tiny boxes where we couldn't even think for ourselves. It wasn't about discipline, it was about keeping us in line. And when you really stop and think about it, it's infuriating. Every rule we followed made us feel smaller and smaller. They tried to control what we wore, what we said, where we ate, and even what we thought. It wasn't about creating a better school environment, it was about forcing us to conform. And what's worse, the rules were inconsistent. If you were favored, you could get away with anything. If you weren't, you were treated like a criminal for the smallest infraction. It's like they wanted to teach us lessons about obedience and power. But at what cost? How much of who we were did they strip away in the name of rule? Honestly, thinking about all of this still makes my blood boil. It's hard to believe some of these rules even existed, let alone how much they messed up. If you've ever experienced anything similar, rules that just didn't make sense, or were just too much, drop a comment below and let me know. Did your school have any dumb rules like these? What was your breaking point? I'd love to hear your story. And if this story got you thinking about your own school experience, make sure to hit that like button, because trust me, this saga isn't over. More crazy school rules more coming your way soon. Stay tuned and remember, stay free, no matter what the rules say.